Blood trickled down his temple as the world blurred around him, the asphalt cool against his cheek. The last thing he remembered was the deafening screech of tires, the horrifying crunch of metal, and then darkness. The expensive watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people's annual salary, was now just a meaningless object to him, its significance lost in the void where his memories should be. The rain fell mercilessly as he stumbled through unfamiliar streets, each droplet a needle against his skin. Pain radiated from his temple, but it was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest, the terrifying emptiness of not knowing who he was. His Italian leather shoes, now scuffed and waterlogged, carried him forward without purpose or destination. The pristine tailored suit that had once commanded respect in boardrooms worldwide now hung from his frame like a costume from someone else's life. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice cut through the downpour, warm and concerned, so different from the clinical sirens that had surrounded him earlier. He turned to see a woman in a waitress uniform, her name tag reading Ellie, standing beneath the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner. She held an umbrella over her head, her eyes widening at the sight of the gash on his forehead. "You're bleeding." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. "I don't." His voice cracked, unfamiliar even to himself. "I don't know who I am." The fear in his voice was raw, unfiltered by the usual walls of privilege and power that had once defined him. Marcus Harrington, though he couldn't remember his name, was experiencing vulnerability for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The 37-year-old venture capitalist whose ruthless decisions had built a financial empire was now reduced to his most fundamental humanity, lost, afraid, and utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers. Ellie Martinez had worked double shifts at Rosie's Diner for 6 years, supporting her younger brother through community college while deferring her own dreams. She had developed an intuition about people, which customers would tip well, which ones to avoid, and which ones needed more than just coffee and pie. Something in this stranger's eyes called to her, a depth of confusion and terror that transcended the expensive clothes and the luxury watch. "Come inside," she said, extending her umbrella to cover him. "Let's get you cleaned up." The diner was nearly empty at this late hour, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across vinyl booths worn thin by decades of patrons. Ellie led him to the employee bathroom, her calloused hands steady as she cleaned the wound on his temple with surprising gentleness. "Should we call the police?" asked the night cook, peering through the doorway with concern. "I already tried the hospital," the stranger said, fragments of memory returning. "They discharged me. Said it was just a concussion. They took my information, but—" He gestured helplessly. "I couldn't tell them anything they didn't already know." "We should still file a report," Ellie said, pressing a clean towel to his head. "Someone must be looking for you." The thought should have been comforting, but instead, it sent a wave of inexplicable dread through him. Who was looking for him? What kind of man inspired fear at the thought of being found? That night, when her shift ended, Ellie made a decision that would alter both their lives irrevocably. She couldn't leave him on the street, confused and injured. "I have a couch," she offered hesitantly. "Just until we figure this out." Her small apartment above a laundromat was a far cry from the penthouse he couldn't remember. The space was modest but meticulously clean, decorated with thrift store finds arranged with obvious care. Photos of Ellie with a young man who shared her eyes, her brother, she explained, lined the walls, along with community college diplomas and a handful of postcards from places she hoped to visit someday. "I'm sorry it's not much," she said, misinterpreting his silence as judgment rather than the overwhelming wave of unfamiliar emotion crashing through him. "It's perfect," he replied, surprising them both with the sincerity in his voice. She lent him her brother's old clothes, faded jeans and a soft t-shirt that felt alien against his skin, yet somehow more comfortable than the tailored suit. The police took a report the next morning, filed a missing person case, took fingerprints that matched no criminal records. "We'll keep looking," they promised, but the lack of urgency in their voices suggested that an adult man with no signs of foul play wasn't their highest priority. Days stretched into weeks. the man she'd nicknamed John. After John Doe, though she tried to make it sound like a choice rather than a placeholder, began to build a new life from scratch. He discovered he had an affinity for numbers when he helped Ellie balance her checkbook, revealing a mind that could calculate complex figures with unusual speed. He found that his hands knew how to tie a perfect Windsor knot even when he couldn't remember learning. Small clues to a life he couldn't recall. What began as an act of kindness gradually transformed into something neither could have predicted. Ellie showed him how to navigate a world without wealth or connections, how to make coffee stretch for days, which grocery stores marked down prices in the evenings, how to find joy in free community concerts in the park. She taught him to see people rather than obstacles or opportunities, to value connection over transaction. For his part, John brought an unexpected perspective to her life. He approached her modest world with a curiosity and appreciation that made her see it through new eyes. The analytical mind he couldn't remember developing helped her create a budget that finally allowed her to start taking one class per semester toward the nursing degree she'd abandoned years ago. Their lives intertwined in the small moments, washing dishes side by side, laughing over late-night reruns, walking through the neighborhood at sunset. The amnesia that had stripped him of his identity had also, perhaps miraculously, stripped away the walls that might have otherwise stood between them. The class differences, the power imbalances, the prejudices that shape so much of human interaction. In the absence of memory, something authentic grew. When she came home exhausted after difficult shifts, he had dinner waiting, simple meals learned from YouTube tutorials played on her ancient laptop. When he woke gasping from nightmares filled with shadowy board meetings and faceless adversaries, she sat beside him until his breathing steadied. "Do you think you are a good person?" she asked one night as they sat on the fire escape, sharing a pint of ice cream and watching the city lights. "Before, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, considering the fragments of himself that occasionally surfaced. The way he automatically reached for the check whenever they went out, the reflexive straightening of his posture when authority figures approached, the dreams of closing deals and signing papers. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I'm trying to be one now." The truth was, Marcus Harrington had been feared more than loved. The empire he built had come at the cost of companies dismantled, careers ended, relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. He had accumulated wealth and influence, but had never known the simple pleasure of being valued simply for his presence, for the comfort his existence brought to another human being. Neither of them was prepared for the morning when everything changed. He woke with a gasp, his head pounding with the force of returning memories. Images flooded his consciousness, board meetings and billion-dollar deals, his empty penthouse with its spectacular view, the parents who had died in his early 20s, leaving him a modest fortune that he'd multiplied through ruthless determination. Marcus Harrington. That was his name. He was 37 years old, CEO of Harrington Ventures, with a net worth that would have paid for Ellie's entire apartment building many times over. He remembered the car accident, driving too fast after a contentious meeting, the momentary distraction that sent his Maserati into a guardrail. He clutched his head in Ellie's tiny bathroom, tears streaming down his face for the first time in decades. He remembered everything, the empire he'd built, the people he'd stepped on to build it, the empty echo of his vast home where no one waited for his return. But most painfully, he remembered the man he had been, calculating, isolated, afraid to trust. In that moment of terrible clarity, Marcus Harrington faced the most important decision of his life. Return to his world of wealth and power, leaving behind the woman who had loved him at his most broken? Or acknowledge that in losing everything, his memory, his status, his carefully constructed walls, he had finally found what mattered most? The answer would change both their lives forever. Ellie found him on the bathroom floor, knees drawn to his chest, his face ashen with shock. Something had changed. She could see it in the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the small space, as if seeing it for the first time. "John," she ventured, the nickname suddenly feeling wrong in her mouth. "What's happening?" He looked up at her, his expression a battlefield of emotions she couldn't fully decode. "My name is Marcus," he said, the words foreign on his tongue after weeks of anonymity. Marcus Harrington. The name meant nothing to Ellie, but the transformation in him was unmistakable. It was as if a stranger now inhabited the body of the man she'd come to know. She sank down beside him on the cold tile floor, their shoulders touching in the cramped space, a connection he didn't pull away from, despite the obvious turmoil. "I remember everything," he whispered, running his hands through his hair that had grown too long for the corporate world he'd once inhabited. "My company, my life, all of it." Ellie listened as fragments of his former existence spilled out, details of Harrington Ventures, the investment firm that had made him a fortune through strategic acquisitions and ruthless efficiency. He spoke of board meetings and private jets, of deals closed over rare whiskey in exclusive clubs. With each revelation, the distance between their worlds stretched wider, threatening to become an unbridgeable chasm. "We should call the police," she said finally, practical even as her heart constricted. "Let them know you've been found." But Marcus shook his head. "Not yet," he said, surprising them both. "I need time to think." That night, they sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, the space between them filled with unspoken questions. Marcus stared at his hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that now bore calluses from helping wash dishes at Rosie's diner when they were short-staffed. "You must think I'm crazy," he said finally, not wanting to go back immediately. Ellie considered him carefully. "I think you're someone who's been given a rare opportunity," she replied. "How many people get to step outside their lives completely and then decide if they want to return?" Her wisdom, born from years of observing humanity from behind a diner counter, struck him with unexpected force. In the weeks that followed his revelation, Marcus existed in a state of limbo, remembering his old life but not yet reclaiming it. Each day became precious, tinged with the knowledge that this borrowed existence must eventually end. Despite his protests, Ellie insisted he stop helping with her rent. "You need to save whatever you have," she told him firmly, "for when you go back." The when, not if, hung between them, acknowledged but not discussed. What amazed Marcus most was how quickly the trappings of wealth had ceased to matter. He'd once spent thousands on watches and suits, yet now found contentment in borrowing a faded Henley shirt from Ellie's brother's abandoned wardrobe. The man who had once insisted on single-origin coffee beans hand-delivered to his office now savored the slightly burnt brew from Rosie's ancient coffee machine, especially when Ellie brought it to him with a smile. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, they walked through the neighborhood park where a local band played jazz standards on a makeshift stage. Ellie wore a sundress she'd found at a thrift store, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical ponytail. Without thinking, Marcus took her hand as they strolled between paper lanterns hung from trees. "Tell me something real," she said suddenly. "Something about the real Marcus Harrington that no one else knows." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've been lonely my entire adult life," he admitted, the words scraped from some hidden place inside him. "I've had business partners and occasional lovers, employees and rivals. But I haven't had a friend, a real friend, since college." The confession hung in the warm night air between them. "Until you." In that moment, the barriers between their worlds seemed to dissolve. Ellie saw not the billionaire CEO, but the man who had emerged from the trauma of forgetting, someone capable of vulnerability and growth, of seeing value in things his bank account couldn't quantify. And Marcus saw in her not just the waitress who had rescued him, but a woman of extraordinary compassion and resilience, whose intelligence and warmth had never been diminished by circumstances that would have broken many others. The kiss that followed wasn't planned or calculated. It held none of the strategic consideration that had dictated Marcus's previous relationships. Instead, it contained only the simple truth of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. The genuine connection they formed defied explanation in either of their previous worlds. In the economic strata Marcus had inhabited, someone like Ellie would have been invisible, another service worker in the background of his privileged existence. In Ellie's experience, men like Marcus, even without knowing his wealth, were passing customers who left generous tips but took little notice of the person serving them. Yet here they were, their lives intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. Marcus found himself sharing secrets he'd never told anyone, about the parents whose expectations still haunted him, about the hollow victories of his corporate conquests. Ellie revealed her own closely guarded dreams, the nursing career sidelined by family responsibility, her hope to someday work in pediatric care. Their connection deepened even as the clock of reality ticked louder. Marcus knew his company would be in turmoil, his absence creating ripples through the financial world. His face had likely been on news reports, his disappearance the subject of speculation. The thought of that world reclaiming him filled him with a dread he couldn't articulate. One rainy afternoon, browsing in a used bookstore, Marcus froze before a business magazine on a dusty shelf. His own face stared back at him from the cover, a photo taken a year earlier when Harrington Ventures had acquired a struggling tech company at a fraction of its value. "The Iceman of Wall Street," the headline proclaimed, detailing his reputation for emotionless precision in business dealings. Ellie found him staring at the magazine, his expression unreadable. She took it from his hands and studied the photo. The perfect suit, the calculated smile that never reached his eyes, the imperial posture of a man accustomed to power. "I don't know him," she said finally, returning the magazine to the shelf. "He's not the man I know." The simplicity of her statement undid him. In her tiny apartment that evening, Marcus faced the truth he'd been avoiding. The life he'd built had never truly satisfied him. The wealth, the power, the respect, all had been pursued as substitutes for the connection and purpose he'd found in these weeks of amnesia and simplicity. "I don't want to be him anymore," Marcus confessed as they sat on her worn couch, rain pattering against the windows. "But I don't know how to be anyone else." Ellie took his hand, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart raced with implications. "You can't hide forever," she said gently. "And you have responsibilities, employees who depend on you, commitments you've made." She was right, of course. The world he'd created couldn't simply be abandoned, no matter how appealing the fantasy of starting fresh. The question wasn't whether he would return to his old life, but what parts of this new existence, what parts of himself discovered in vulnerability, he would carry back with him. As September turned to October, the inevitable moment arrived. A detective called Ellie's phone. They traced the missing persons report to her address through routine follow-up. The machinery of Marcus's former life had finally caught up with him. That night, they faced each other across the kitchen table once more, the air heavy with unspoken fears and desires. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to his penthouse, his company, his position. The expensive watch he'd arrived with, carefully stored in Ellie's dresser drawer, would once again adorn his wrist. Designer suits would replace borrowed t-shirts. "Come with me," he said suddenly, reaching for her hands across the table. Not as anything you don't want to be. Just don't let this end." Ellie's eyes, always so direct, searched his face. "Your world would eat me alive," she said with the honesty that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "And I have responsibilities here, my brother, my job, my classes." "Then I'll come to you," Marcus insisted. "We'll find a way." But they both recognized the challenge ahead. Their connection, formed in the unique crucible of his amnesia, would face tests neither could fully anticipate. The man without memory had been free to discover himself anew. Marcus Harrington, CEO, would be expected to slide back into the role he'd spent years perfecting. As dawn broke on his last morning in her apartment, Marcus watched Ellie sleeping, her face peaceful in the soft light. He memorized every detail, the curve of her cheek, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her hair splayed across the pillow. Whatever happened next, he knew with absolute certainty that the connection they had formed had forever changed him. The man who had once valued people only for their utility or strategic advantage now understood the profound worth of being seen for oneself, flaws and all. The executive who had built walls of wealth and privilege now recognized them as the very barriers that had kept him from authentic connection. The question remained, could these worlds truly merge, Or would the gravitational pull of his former life eventually tear apart what they had built in this suspended reality? As the first rays of sunlight filled the room, Marcus Harrington faced the most profound challenge of his existence, not a business deal or market crisis, but the task of integrating who he had been with who he had become. The penthouse felt like a museum of someone else's life. Marcus stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by minimalist furniture chosen by an interior designer whose name he couldn't recall. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline he had once considered the ultimate status symbol. Now, it only emphasized how far removed he was from the street-level humanity he'd experienced these past weeks. His assistant, Catherine, efficient, professional, and visibly relieved at his return, had arranged everything with clinical precision. His calendar had been cleared for 3 days. For recovery, she explained, though urgent matters had been flagged for his immediate attention. His private physician had been scheduled for a complete evaluation. His tailor would arrive tomorrow to replace the wardrobe that had mysteriously disappeared with him. "The board is eager to meet as soon as you're ready," Catherine informed him, her tablet at the ready. "They've managed interim operations, but several major decisions have been deferred, pending your return." Marcus nodded absently, fingering the crisp collar of his new shirt. The fabric felt foreign against his skin, too stiff, too perfect. "Thank you," he said, the corporate politeness automatic. "I'll review everything tonight." When she left, the silence of the penthouse enveloped him like a vacuum. No distant sounds of neighbors through thin walls. No hum of the ancient refrigerator that had punctuated his conversations with Ellie. No life. He moved through the space like a ghost, opening drawers and cabinets that contained expensive possessions he barely remembered acquiring. In his home office, the wall displayed framed magazine covers featuring his face, awards from industry associations, photographs of handshakes with political figures, the curated evidence of a successful life. His phone, a replacement for the one shattered in the accident, buzzed continuously with messages from business associates, rivals pretending to be friends, acquaintances curious about the gossip potential of his disappearance. None asked how he was feeling. None expressed genuine concern for his well-being rather than his company's stock price. That night, he sat alone at his dining table designed to seat 12, eating takeout from the high-end restaurant that had his preferences on file. The food was exquisite, the wine perfectly paired. He found himself missing the slightly overcooked pasta Ellie had made in her tiny kitchen, the two of them laughing as they tried to follow an online recipe. The board meeting 3 days later was a crucible. Marcus entered the conference room to measured applause, handshakes, and shoulders clapped in masculine ritual. He had prepared meticulously, reviewing quarterly reports and pending decisions until dawn. His suit was impeccable, his demeanor controlled. To the casual observer, Marcus Harrington had returned unchanged. "Quite an adventure you've had," remarked Gerald Winters, the eldest board member, with the indulgent smile one might offer a child. "Amnesia. Like something from a film." "Fortunate it's resolved," added Victoria Chin, her eyes sharp behind designer frames. "The market doesn't appreciate uncertainty." The meeting proceeded with discussion of acquisitions and quarterly projections. Marcus participated with practiced ease, his business acumen apparently undiminished by his absence. Yet inside, a profound disconnection grew with each PowerPoint slide. The numbers represented real businesses, real people whose lives would be upended by the decisions made in this room. "The Jensen Media acquisition is undervalued by at least 15%, argued Clayton Reynolds, the CFO. "If we move quickly, before year-end, we can implement immediate restructuring and eliminate redundancies." Conservative estimates put staff reductions at 30%. 6 weeks ago, Marcus would have nodded approvingly at the clinical efficiency. Now, he found himself thinking of specific people, like Miguel at the diner whose second job supported his family after his primary employer downsized. Redundancies and staff reductions were human beings with rent payments and children's tuition. What if we considered a different approach? Marcus heard himself asking, to the visible surprise of the board. Jensen has valuable talent and market penetration. Perhaps we should focus on integration and growth rather than immediate cost-cutting. The silence that followed was palpable. Victoria exchanged glances with Gerald. Clayton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Marcus," Victoria said carefully, "their outdated operational model is precisely why the acquisition makes sense. Sentimentality about their workforce undermines shareholder value." The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, Marcus saw clearly the values that underpin the empire he had built: the relentless prioritization of profit over people, efficiency over humanity. He had once embraced these principles without question. Now they felt hollow. In the weeks that followed, Marcus moved between worlds with increasing dissonance. By day, he navigated board meetings and investor calls, maintaining the facade of the ruthless businessman they expected. By night, he escaped the penthouse whenever possible to meet Ellie in the modest neighborhoods he had once only seen from his car window. Their relationship existed in a fragile balance, neither fully belonging in the other's reality. When he took her to a Michelin-starred restaurant, she wore a dress borrowed from a friend and faced the intimidating array of silverware with quiet determination. When he joined her for karaoke night with her coworkers, he wore jeans and a simple button-down, trying to blend into an environment where authentic joy mattered more than status. "You're straddling two lives," Ellie observed one evening as they walked through a park far from his usual haunts. "It's not sustainable, Marcus." She was right, of course. The dual existence was taking its toll. His executive team had noticed his distraction, his reluctance to approve aggressive tactics that had once been his trademark. Rumors circulated about the accident having affected his judgment. Meanwhile, Ellie's friends regarded him with understandable suspicion, the wealthy businessman who would inevitably break their friend's heart when he tired of slumming. The breaking point came with the Mitchell deal, a potential acquisition that had been in development before his accident. The family-owned media company was vulnerable after the founder's death, its assets undervalued. The strategy developed by his team was textbook Harrington Ventures: acquire controlling interest, strip valuable assets, dissolve the remaining operations. The night before the final decision, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the employee roster of Mitchell Media. 317 people. 317 lives that would be disrupted, many likely destroyed, by his signature on a document. Once, he would have seen only spreadsheet cells, not human stories. His phone rang, Ellie calling after her late shift. "You sound exhausted," she said, concern evident even through the digital connection. "Big decision tomorrow," he replied, unable to fully articulate the moral crisis he faced. A deal that would have been automatic before everything. And now I see the people behind the numbers. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "But if I don't do this, someone else will. That's business." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "Is that the only way business can be?" she finally asked. "Or is that just the story people tell themselves to justify choices they know are harmful?" Her question haunted him through a sleepless night. By dawn, Marcus had made a decision that would change everything. The boardroom fell silent as Marcus outlined his proposal. Instead of dismantling Mitchell Media, Harrington Ventures would invest in its transformation, preserving jobs while strategically repositioning the company for the digital marketplace. The acquisition would proceed, but as a partnership rather than a conquest. "This is not the Harrington approach," objected Reynolds, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Our investors expect maximum return, not social experiments." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Then perhaps it's time to redefine the Harrington approach," he replied. "Mitchell has valuable intellectual property and a talented workforce. Destroying that for short-term gain is short-sighted." The resistance was immediate and fierce. Board members questioned his judgment, his commitment to the company's philosophy, even his fitness to lead after his trauma. The meeting ended without resolution, but Marcus recognized the battle lines had been drawn. That evening, he waited for Ellie at a small Italian restaurant they had discovered together. When she arrived, her face flushed from rushing from class, he felt a certainty he had never experienced in years of high-stakes business decisions. "I'm going to lose my company," he told her without preamble. "If not immediately, then eventually. I've set something in motion today that can't be reversed." Ellie listened as he explained the situation, the board's reaction, the likely investor fallout, the probable coup that would follow if he continued on this path. "You could back down," she suggested, though her eyes told him she knew he wouldn't. "Return to business as usual." Marcus shook his head. "I can't be that person anymore," he said simply. "I've seen another way to exist in the world. I can't unsee it." The weeks that followed brought exactly the conflict he had anticipated. The board formally challenged his leadership, citing erratic behavior following his accident. Major investors threatened to withdraw. Business publications that had once celebrated his cutthroat tactics now questioned his mental stability. Throughout the storm, Marcus discovered a resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He had built Harrington Ventures through brilliant strategy and relentless determination. Now he applied those same qualities to transforming it. He met privately with key investors, articulating a vision of sustainable growth and ethical leadership. He recruited board members who shared his evolving philosophy. He leveraged his considerable personal wealth to maintain controlling interest when others divested. The battle was brutal, expensive, and public. Marcus lost allies he had counted on for years. His reputation in certain circles was irreparably damaged. Yet slowly, improbably, a new version of Harrington Ventures began to emerge, one that measured success not just in profit margins but in human impact. Throughout it all, Ellie remained his touchstone, the person who had seen his humanity when he himself had forgotten it. Their worlds gradually merged, not without difficulty, but with growing harmony. She continued her nursing studies with a scholarship now funded by a Harrington Foundation initiative. He simplified his life, selling the penthouse for a comfortable but modest home in a diverse neighborhood. 1 year to the day after his accident, Marcus stood before the employees of the newly restructured Mitchell Media. The company had not only survived but was beginning to thrive under a model that prioritized innovation and worker well-being alongside profitability. "A year ago, I experienced what some would call a tragedy," he told the assembled staff. "I lost my memory, my identity, everything I thought defined me. But in that loss, I found something invaluable, a perspective I would never have gained otherwise." In the back of the room, Ellie watched with quiet pride, her nursing textbooks tucked under her arm. She had been right that day in the park. Straddling two worlds was unsustainable. The solution hadn't been choosing one world over the other, but creating something new that incorporated the best of both. Later that evening, in the garden of their home, Marcus knelt before Ellie with a small velvet box. The ring inside wasn't the ostentatious diamond his former self would have chosen, but a unique design they had created together, incorporating stones that had belonged to her grandmother. "You saw me when I couldn't see myself," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You loved me when I was nothing but a stranger. Will you build a life with me now that I finally know who I am?" Ellie's eyes filled with tears as she pulled him to his feet. "I loved you when you were lost," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "I love you even more now that you've found your way." As they embraced under the garden lights, Marcus Harrington reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had lost an empire of wealth only to gain an empire of purpose. He had surrendered the hollow admiration of the business world and found instead the profound gift of being truly known and loved. In the end, his greatest achievement wasn't the fortune he'd amassed or the companies he'd built, but the moral courage to reinvent himself, to honor the authentic bond formed during his most vulnerable moment by becoming a man worthy of that connection. The waitress who had once tended his wounds had indeed received the surprise of her life, not in material wealth or status, but in witnessing and participating in the transformation of a soul that had once been as lost as his memory.